So this morning, we are going to be reading Ephesians 4, 1 to 16. So you can open with me if you want, in your Bibles, in your apps, whatever works for you. I am reading from the New Testament for Everyone version, but you can read from any translation you want, and it's going to be roughly the same. So here we go. So then, this is my appeal to you. Yes, it is me, the prisoner of the Lord. You must live up to the calling you've received. Bear with one another in love. Be humble, meek, and patient in every way with one another. Make every effort to guard the unity that the Spirit gives, with your lives bound together in peace. There is one body and one Spirit. You were, after all, called to one hope, which goes with your call. There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. But grace was given to each one of us according to the measures the King used when he was distributing gifts. That's why it says, when he went up on high, he led bondage itself into bondage and gave gifts to people. When it was said that he went up, what it also means is that he also came down to the lower place, that is the earth. The one who came down is the one who also went up, yes, above all the heavens, so that he might fill all things. So these are the gifts that he gave. Some were to be apostles, others prophets, others evangelists, and others pastors and teachers. Their job is to give God's people the equipment they need for their work of service, so as to build up the king's body. The purpose of this is that we should all reach unity in our belief and loyalty in knowing God's Son. Then we will reach the stature of the mature man, measured by the standard of the King's fullness. As a result, we won't be babies any longer. We won't be thrown this way or that way on the stormy sea, blown about by every gust of teaching, by human tricksters, by their cunning and deceitful scheming. Instead, we must speak the truth in love and grow up in everything into him, that is, into the King who is the head. He supplies the growth that the whole body needs, linked as it is and held together by every joint which supports it, which each member is doing its own proper work. Then the body builds itself up in love. So today, in this age that we find ourselves in, the church is divided oftentimes in opposing poles. You know, we might have disagreements about the place of women, the power of the Holy Spirit, or how to interpret and apply Scripture, and so many more. And I think this really sad thing is that we often find out that sometimes other Christians could be the most vicious people that we ever encounter. That Christians oftentimes have an easier time being gracious to non-Christians than to Christians with whom they have theological differences. But I think deep down in our bones we know that this isn't the way that it's supposed to be. So Paul is talking about how we cultivate unity within the body. And in this, what he's going to say essentially is that there are characteristics that we need to cultivate that will make it easier for us to be uniters rather than dividers. And that then when we look at the church and we see diversity, we have to understand that diversity is actually a feature that was baked right into the church's DNA, not a bug that's the sign of a problem in the church. And finally, we can understand that the church was given this diversity because that diversity helps the church to grow up and become mature and Christ-like. So let's sort of unpack this argument here one step at a time. So the first part that I want to look at here is where he says, bear with one another in love. Be humble, meek, and patient in every way with one another. So the first of these characteristics is humility. And Paul starts this passage by talking about how he is the prisoner of the Lord. And of course, as we've mentioned before, being a prisoner is generally considered a strike against you, right? It's not something that people generally brag about. But Paul brags about it here because he understands that his being a prisoner puts him in following the example of Jesus. So Jesus gives his life in service to others to create this way of reconciliation between God and people. And Paul surrenders his freedom and eventually his life in order to announce this way of reconciliation that Jesus has opened. And so his being imprisoned is a part of his continuing the work of Jesus. And so it doesn't detract from his authority. In the logic of the kingdom, his being a prisoner actually gives him additional credibility. He is showing humility. So what is humility? Humility is an accurate view of self and others and God. When we look at ourselves and other people's, we understand that we were made in the image of God. In other words, God has created us, designed us with an immense amount of prestige and worth. But at the same time, that image of God has been distorted and broken by human sinfulness. And so every person is both made in the image of God and broken and sinful. And this tension between these two things is kind of where we find ourselves. But it also affects the way that we see every other person. It's easy for me to think that I'm a good person. Oh, yeah, I do wrong things and whatnot, but at my heart, I really feel like I'm a good person. It's easy for me to judge somebody else as the problem. Or sometimes it's backwards from that. But what I have to understand is that whatever sin I see in the lives of another person, it may look different than mine on the surface, but it is the fruit of the same plant. That our sinfulness and our brokenness is a result of the sinfulness and brokenness that is common to all of us. And so if I'm tempted to look down my nose at another Christian or another person because they're sinful in a way that I'm not, then humility tells me, no, actually, I have no business looking down my nose at another person because essentially we're all in the same boat. Humility also requires that we have an accurate view of God. Now, our own culture, so North American early 21st century culture, the highest thing I think that we value is freedom. Now, different people mean different things by freedom, but in our own culture and in our own time, I think what people mean by freedom is the ability to do what I want when I want. Autonomy, to be a law unto ourselves. But the problem is, for community to happen, we need to have a common set of expectations, a common set of understandings about things. And if we don't have those, then all of our relationships are bound to have friction within them. If every person insists on being the king, then every person will be the king of a kingdom of one person. And that's no way for us to build kingdoms or to build communities. At the same time, we can't just necessarily just submit to whatever authority happens to be over us, because oftentimes authorities use and abuse the people under them. As Jesus says, you know how it is with the pagans. They lord it over their subjects. They get all high and mighty and let everyone know it. But that's not how it is to be with you. If any of you wants to be great, he must be your servant. If anyone wants to be first, he must be the slave of all. That's how it is with the Son of Man. He didn't come to have servants obey him, but to be a servant and to give his life as a ransom for many. So we have a hard time submitting to authorities over us because we may fear that those authorities are trying to exploit us. At the same time, though, we can submit to the authority of God. And that's because we see God's power at work in the cross. God raises Jesus from the dead, showing that he's powerful. But God demonstrates who he is in Jesus, the one who surrenders his authority and goes to the cross for the sake of us. And so we can see that God is both powerful, but he is also humble at the same time. He's also the person who uses the power that he has not for his own ends, but he uses the power that he has to benefit us. And so we can see God is truly benevolent, and we can submit ourselves to his authority, knowing that he will never crush or exploit or demean us, but that his desire is to build us up and to make us into people who can live to be truly free and truly reflect the design for which we were originally intended. The second characteristic that Paul lays out here that we have to cultivate in order to be a uniter and not a divider is meekness. If we have humility, then we will have meekness, or your translation might say gentleness, in our dealings with other people. We view other people through the lens of our own failures, understanding that they are broken and sinful in the same way that we are. The German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "If my sinfulness appears to me in any way smaller or less detestable in comparison with the sin of others, I'm still not recognizing my sinfulness at all." So when we come to the realization of our own sinfulness, when we understand our place in relationship to others and to God, then we will necessarily become gentle in our dealings with other people and not unnecessarily offensive. And the third characteristic that Paul lays out here is patience. But when he talks about patience, he doesn't mean like the ability to wait longer periods of time, so much as he means the ability to bear with other people's weaknesses and faults. Because Christians fail us. Anybody, show of hands, anybody who's never been failed by another Christian? Yeah. So Christians fail us, and quite frankly, the church is always going to be a place, even if it's functioning properly, where people can hurt us, because the church is a place where people are supposed to be growing in maturity and Christ-likeness. But as they do that, they will become missionaries, reaching out into the community in which they find themselves and bringing in other people who aren't yet formed in the image of Christ. And those people are going to be potentially the kind of people who might harm people. At the same time, I think a lot of our disappointment often stems from when leaders and people who've been Christians a long time, people who ought to know better, hurt us within the church. That is a genuine danger that we face when we come to church. We can't be naive about the fact that other Christians in our midst may do things and say things that they should not say, but that we need to be able to be the ones to extend grace and patience and forgiveness to the other people around us, because patience and forgiveness is the lubrication that allows this machinery of community to actually function. So, if we are going to be uniters and not dividers, we have to learn humility, meekness or gentleness, and patience with each other. When we do this, we might look at the diversity of the church and wonder about it. You see that the church is made up of, the church has one God, but we have many different giftings and temperaments inside of the church. Some people are really good at administration. That's not me. There's other people who are really good at teaching. Some people are good at ministering to kids. Some people have just a quiet wisdom about them. And when we exalt one of those giftings or a smaller group of those giftings, first of all, we insult the giver of the gift. But secondly, we distort the ministry of the church. So if we just say that preaching the sermon is where church is all about, that you guys are just here to listen to me talk this morning, that teaching is an important part of the church's life, but so is living in relationship. We learn how to be a united church in our relationships with one another. And so if we focus on the things that impart knowledge, but not on practicing being a church together, then we're going to distort the ministry of the church and make it all about what's in my head and not make it at all about how we interact together as a body. And by the same token, if we overemphasize the relational ministry of the church and forget the teaching ministry, then we might have a club of people who are really tight-knit and who really enjoy each other and who are blessed by each other, but we don't know what we stand for. And so we'll likely drift all over the place. We'll fall into bad doctrine, which will poison our ministry. So we need to have all of these different places, these different pieces, these different giftings working in the church, and then that will make us able to appropriately minister. And in the broader church, we see this sort of diversity as well, right? So some churches are really charismatic, and others are a little bit more staid. Some are formal, and others you come as you are. Some emphasize social justice, and others emphasize evangelism. And while I'm not saying that every expression of church is equally valid, I think the fact that there are different churches that all kind of do church a little differently is not a scandal to be avoided, but something that we should be comfortable with. And we need to resist the temptation to judge other churches according to our way of doing church or our preference for how to do church. So if we are a small church, it's really easy for us to then go, oh, well, only small churches can really do God's work. Big churches are just, it's too impersonal, couldn't possibly do anything helpful. If we're an informal church, we might say, oh, people can come as they are. These formal churches, they create too high a bar for people to come in, and they're too stuffy. God can't possibly work through that. And if we see churches that are more liberal than we are, we might say, oh, those people, they've gone all wishy-washy with their doctrine. And then we see churches that are more conservative than we are, and we say, oh, they're so harsh. The thing is, again, not everything is equally valid. But when we see difference in the church, our first instinct sometimes is to criticize, and we need to withhold and ask God for discernment and understand that there are always going to be people who do it a little differently than we do, and that's okay. So we understand that there is diversity in the church, and that's actually part of the church's design. What is that diversity there for? That diversity is there. Well, Paul says, so these are the gifts that were given, and he lays out the gifts. Their job is to give God's people the equipment they need to build, or need for their work of service, and to build up the king's body. In the past, a couple of generations, there was an emphasis on being a seeker-sensitive church. And so what that model really said is that you guys out here, your job is just to go and bring your friends to church. If you have coworkers, you have family members who don't go to church, you need to go and invite them to church and get them to come in here, and then the pastor and any other paid staff can kind of do their professional Christian thing on these people. But as I said before, when we emphasize one set of gifts at the expense of others, we distort the ministry of the church. And so what that did, when we did church that way, is it created a sort of distorted ministry that focused on one set of gifts, the pastoral set of gifts, and to the detriment of all of the other things. It basically sidelined everybody in the church except for the paid church staff. Instead, we have to understand that the church is like a team in which every person has a role that is critically important to the success of the whole organization. Think about it this way. What happens if I have a baseball team? And on that team, a bunch of the people just don't do the roles that they're supposed to do. So I have a center fielder who refuses to run. He just kind of walks. So when the ball gets hit out to him, he saunters over and picks it up off the grass. And of course, anybody who's hit it out there is already home. We have a catcher who doesn't like to go to the field. He only likes to bat. So when everybody's taking the field, he just stays in the dugout. Or we have a pitcher who just lobs the ball over home plate. I don't want to make my arm tired by throwing the ball fast. Well, you might expect that if this team isn't playing a bunch of 5-year-olds from Little League, that this team is not going to have a tremendous amount of success if they're not actually trying their best and playing as a team. And it's a similar idea for us as a church. If we have a role to play within this church that God has called us to and equipped us for, when we fail to actually embrace that position, then the whole community is worse off for it. Or to use another metaphor, the church is the image of God. We are a picture of what God is supposed to look like to the community. But when you look at this picture, what's the first thing you see? The first thing I see is that there's a piece missing. So I see the fact that there's a piece missing before I see what the actual picture itself is. And so when we we are all basically made to fill a unique role, like a piece in the puzzle. And when we fail to live up to that role, when we fail to embrace that role, we become the piece that doesn't go into the whole. And that's the first thing that people see. They see not the beauty of the picture of God in our midst, but the places where it's not quite working the way it's supposed to. That's just kind of how we're wired. So maybe the Lord is calling you to do something in the church, for the church, and you're resisting the call. Maybe you feel like, I don't know if I got the time. Maybe you feel like, who, me? I'm not qualified to do that. Maybe you feel like, I'm just so tired, I don't know how I could do that. And so we are saying no to God. And if we do that, then the church becomes like a puzzle with a missing piece. And if you're missing the piece entirely, isn't that annoying? And maybe you have the desire to serve in some way, but you don't have the opportunity. Maybe the Lord has laid something on your heart about how you can serve the church, but the venue for that service is not in the church. Well, if that's the case, I'd recommend find somebody in the church that you trust, somebody you feel is wise and has the Spirit. Talk to them about it. Now, not everything that we want to do is something that God has laid on our hearts. Sometimes our own selfish ambition can distort our view of that. But if somebody who's a Spirit-filled Christian affirms that this is something that God might be calling you to, then maybe this is something to explore with church leadership. I'd have to say, if you feel like you don't have the opportunity to serve God in the way that you've been called to serve God, to tell me about it. And I think I probably speak for the church leadership when I say, if you are called to do something, then we want to support you in that. We want to make space for you to be faithful to God in the way that you've been called to serve Him. And so I hope that everyone can, I realize that there are limitations that we all face at times. Maybe our health isn't what it should be. Maybe we have small kids and that sort of precludes doing a whole lot outside of the home. But that we're all open to the call of God, to how we can serve the church, how we can work with the church, how we can bless each other. And as we do that, then we fill in the holes for the picture that we have. So in summary, what Paul is saying is that we need to cultivate unity by being the kinds of people who unite and not divide. But then when we look at the church, we have to understand that diversity is okay. Unity does not mean uniformity. That the diversity has a position, has a reason in the church, and that we have to embrace that diversity so that the church can be built up for the work that God has placed before it. The church is the image of God. So are we as individuals. But when the world sees us as a congregation or sees us as a church in Kirkland Lake, they see an image of something, but what is the image that they see?